Hello, welcome to Esther's Legacy. After all, we are here for such a time as this. I want to give a couple of announcements today before we get started. We are having, for Restoration Messianic Fellowship, we are having our Passover Seder on April 15th at 6 o'clock at First Baptist Church in Morristown, Tennessee in the Fellowship Hall. If you would like to join us there, we would love to have you. Just let us know. We're excited about that, actually. And also remember, come the following day for our Shabbat services at 1 o'clock, same place. And we are going to celebrate the first day of unleavened bread together. So come prepared. Well, there'll be an oneg afterward. We would love to have you. The feasts are upon us, and it's an exciting time. And right now we are still in the book of Esther. I will say this, next week I want to take a break from the book of Esther, and I want to talk about Passover and unleavened bread and first fruits as well. So if you join us next week, we'll be taking a break from the book of Esther and focusing in on Passover. But today we are in chapter 5 of the book of Esther. So let's go ahead and turn there. If you'll remember, last week we were doing chapter 4, and that was the chapter that had our saying, our logo, our quote in it, for such a time as this, right? Esther was placed in a very strategic position for such a time that God needed her to be there. God knew what would come into the mind of Haman. He knew what the enemy was going to try to do, and he knew who he needed in the right position to be able to deal with the situation. And in this case, that was Esther, Queen Esther. Sorry about that. So we see that Esther is in the right position. She has asked Mordecai. Actually, she's commanded Mordecai. Remember that discussion? She's commanded Mordecai to have all the Jews to pray for her and fast for her. And that her and her maids are going to do the same. And so that's what she does. She fasts for 3 days. And that is where chapter 5 picks up. So let's pick up in the beginning of chapter 5. On the 3rd day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner courtyard of the king's palace opposite the king's hall. I'm going to stop right there. What day is it? She's going in on the 3rd day. Now, next week we're going to talk about Passover and unleavened bread and first fruits. But today I just want us to focus in on something that's right here in front of us. It's the 3rd day. Do you remember what day the edict went out in Susa? It would have went out on Passover. And now we are 3 days later after that. She's been fasting. Mordecai and the Jews and Esther and Susa, along with her maids, have been fasting, presumably for Passover, for the next day, and for the next day after that. It is the 3rd day. She's going in, and she is about to ask something of the king. But she goes in on that 3rd day. What day did our Lord rise from the dead? She may very well have went in on first fruits. Let that sink in for a minute. Whether it happened directly 3 days after Passover, or it happened later in the week of unleavened bread. And remember, with unleavened bread and first fruits, if the day of first fruits is after the weekly Sabbath, then it could be any time during, or how do I put this? The day of first fruits could actually be on the 4th or 5th or 6th day of unleavened bread, if it's on the Shabbat, the weekly Shabbat of if it's on the weekly Shabbat during unleavened bread. Okay? So she may very well have gone into the king on first fruits. If not, she might have gone in any day of unleavened bread. She might have made her request on the very last day of unleavened bread, which is also a Sabbath or Shabbat. Okay? No matter what day she went in, it's the third day from the time they started to fast. And she goes in wearing her royal robes. She's not going in just as a regular citizen. She's not going into the presence of her king just as his wife. She is going in as queen. She puts on her royal robes. And I want to talk about that for a minute too. Because if you remember, let's turn to Revelation. Let's turn to Revelation chapter 19. Okay? We're going to be in different places today because there's a lot in this chapter that speaks toward other things. So in Revelation 19, starting in verse 6, it says, "Then I heard what sounded like the roar of a huge crowd, like the sound of rushing waters, like loud peals of thunder, saying, Hallelujah! Adonai, heaven, our God of heaven's army, has begun to reign. Let us rejoice and be glad. Let us give him the glory, for the time has come for the wedding of the Lamb, and his bride has prepared herself. Fine linen, bright and clean, has been given her to wear." The fine linen means the righteous deeds of God's people. If you remember in Ephesians, let me go there real quick. Ephesians chapter 2. Many of us might have learned Ephesians 2, 8, and 9 as we were growing up in Sunday school or in Vacation Bible School. These two verses say this: "For you have been delivered by grace through trusting or through faith, and even this is not your accomplishment, but God's gift. You were not delivered by your own actions. Therefore, no one should boast." We learn those verses, and some of us even learn the next verse, but let's look at what it says. "For we are of God's making," we're God's workmanship, right? "Created in union with Messiah Yeshua for a life of good actions already prepared by God for us to do." Now, if our royal robes, if the wedding gown of the bride are our righteous acts, and these righteous acts were prepared in advance for us to do, what is the acts prepared in advance for us to do? What had God prepared for his people to do in this life? Is it not obedience to his word? Let's turn, let me get to the right page here in just a minute, but let's turn to John chapter 14. This is a Bible study today. John chapter 14. I've got to get there, and I went past it. John chapter 14. And we will be in verses 12 through 16. And I am reading out of the Complete Jewish Bible, if you're wondering. Verse 12 says this: "Yes, indeed, I tell you that whoever trusts in me will also do the works I do. Indeed, he will do greater ones, because I am going to the Father. In fact, whatever you ask for in my name, I will do, so that the Father may be glorified in the Son. If you ask me for something in my name, I will do it. And I'm going to pause here because in a lot of our Bible versions, unfortunately, the next couple of verses are separated from what I just read by titles of sections in our Bibles. But it is a continuing thought. So let's begin to read in verse 15. If you love me, you will keep my commands, and I will ask the Father, and he will give you another comforting counselor like me, the Spirit of truth, to be with you forever. Okay, so Yeshua is going to ask the Father for the Spirit to come upon his people to help them obey him. If you love me, you will obey my commands, and you will do even greater works than I do. Well, what were the works that Yeshua did? Yeshua obeyed his Father in everything. He obeyed the Torah. Yeshua obeyed the law, and he taught others to obey it. And so the works that God prepared in advance for us to do is none other than the works of the Torah, or in this case, the Mosaic covenant. Okay? And that, of course, includes the feasts that are coming up. Okay? So God prepared for his people things to do to obey him. Yeshua taught those things. He lived those things. He ministered out of obeying his Father. Okay? He loved the way his Father told his people to love. And so the works that he is asking us to obey, the commands he is asking us to obey, are the very things his Father has told us to obey. And he is going to send the counselor, another counselor, the Holy Spirit, the Spirit of truth, to help them obey. How do we know that the Spirit was given to help people obey? Ezekiel 36:26 and 27 tell us that. If we want to turn there real quick, we see that if you come to Restoration Fellowship, you know that we read these verses quite often in our service because they are just so very important. Verse 26 and 27 of Ezekiel 36 say this: I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit inside you. I will take the stony heart out of your flesh and give you a heart of flesh. I will put my spirit inside you and cause you to live by my laws, respect my rulings, and obey them. If you love me, you will obey me. And Yeshua does not contradict the Father ever. And so these royal robes, so to speak, for the believer, the wedding gown of the bride, is our obedience to his commands. Our righteous acts are our obedience. We clothe ourselves with, remember, we take off the old man and put on the new. The new man is obedient to God through the power of the Spirit. We see that in Romans chapter 8, where Paul tells us that the old man, or the flesh, cannot obey the law of God. But we are not to live according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. It is so important that we understand what our royal robes are. That is why when in Revelations it says that the bride has made herself ready. How has she made herself ready? She has been obedient. She has been obedient to her king. She has been obedient to her husband. She's been obedient to her God. And these things shine for her, right? They give her glory. And that glory is not her own. It is the glory of the Son, who is the exact representation of the Father's glory. so that the things that God gave us to obey came from the very mouth of God. The Son taught those things, lived those things. He commanded his people to live those things. If we love him, we will live as he lived, according to 1 John. And so we walk in those ways. And that is our royal robe. That is our bridal gown. So we need to take those things very seriously. And that does not mean that we do them perfectly all the time, that we never get anything wrong. But that just means that we consciously try to obey our Father. That we make those things a priority in our life and not just set them aside and say, I can't keep them perfectly, so I'm not even going to try. That is not what God has called us to. The greater things, the things that come out of the children of God who trust God, who trust in Yeshua and obey him. The things he allows his people to do, whether it's quote unquote miracles of healing or whether or not it's simply, and this may seem like a small thing, but it's a huge thing within the kingdom. Telling someone else about him and his ways. Telling someone about your bridegroom. Telling someone about your king that you love and that you love to obey. Okay? So Esther goes before her king in her royal robes, her royal best. She's coming to him in his hall, in the hall of the king. He's on his throne, and she's coming into his presence in her royal best. She is dressed as queen. And is that not the case for the bride of Messiah? Okay. Verse 2 of chapter 5 of Esther. When the king saw Esther, the queen, standing in the courtyard, she won his favor. Do you remember chapter 1? Queen Vashti displeased him because she would not appear before him when he called. Here, Esther has come before him, dressed as his queen, standing there patiently, not barging in, insisting on his attention, but standing there with dignity and with patience, waiting for her king to recognize his queen, waiting for him to recognize her. And he does. And remember what we talked about, that they may have been fasting and praying for, that he would be in the right disposition when she went in, that he wouldn't be in the middle of something extremely important and extremely busy and be irritated that she has come into the royal hall. Well, God has answered that prayer, and he is pleased to see her. She has won his favor. And that word favor can also be translated grace. She has won the grace of her king. And so she is noticed. Continuing, so the king extended the gold scepter in his hand toward Esther. And Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. She is in the presence of her king, who is seated on his throne, in his courtroom, in his royal hall. This is a very serious time. Not only could this event have cost her life if she had not won the grace and favor of her king, but she is taking being in his presence, in his royal hall, in his courtroom very seriously. I want us to take a look at our king's royal hall. We find it in Daniel chapter 7. verses 9 through 14. Verse 9, as I watched, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient One, the Ancient of Days, took his seat. His clothing was white as snow. The hair on his head was like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames with wheels of burning fire. And a stream of fire flowed from his presence. Thousands of thousands ministered to him. Millions and millions stood before him. And then the court was convened and the books were opened. I kept watching. And then, because of the arrogant words which the horn was speaking, I watched as the animal was killed. Its body was destroyed, and it was given over to be burned up completely. As for the other animals, their rulership was taken away, but their lives were prolonged for a time and a season. I kept watching the night visions when I saw coming with the clouds of heaven someone like the Son of Man. He approached the Ancient One, the Ancient of Days, and was led into his presence. To him was given rulership, glory, and a kingdom, so that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His rulership is an eternal rulership that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. Does this sound like a courtroom that we can just come in as casually as we want, just willy-nilly walking right in and saying, "Hi, Dad, how you doing?" No. The Ancient One is on his throne. His throne was fiery flames with wheels of burning fire. A stream of fire flowed from his presence. And if you remember, Scripture talks about God as a consuming fire. This is the ultimate courtroom. And the enemy, when he just barges in and begins to speak arrogantly to the king, to the Ancient of Days, he is instantly destroyed. That scepter does not go out. The others are allowed to live for a short time. But as we know, their time even is coming. And then Daniel says he sees someone approach the Ancient of Days, the Ancient One, that Son of Man. The Son of Man is one of Yeshua's royal titles. He's coming in as the Son of Man. He's coming in with one of his royal titles before his Father. Okay? And we'll get to some of the other things it says in just a minute. But as he approaches, who does God, in a sense, extend the scepter to? The horn or the Son of Man? Of course, it's the Son of Man. The horn, the Antichrist, is immediately destroyed. Okay? So when we see this account in Esther, we're seeing her approach the king, and she is being seen as someone who is favorable to the king, as someone who he delights in, not someone he wishes to destroy. Okay? And we, as the children of God, we should know that we can approach our King with confidence, not casually, not arrogantly. But let's look to Hebrews chapter 4, And let's look at verse 16, where it says, "Therefore, let us confidently approach the throne from which God gives grace, so that we may receive mercy and find grace in our time of need." So we confidently approach the throne of our King. We come in our royal best, having been obedient to our King. We come in with dignity and honor and awe and fear of our King. The fear of the Lord does not go away just because Yeshua died on the cross, on the tree. It does not go away. We are still to approach him in the fear of the Lord, in that awe, in that reverence, and yes, fear. But in that we can come confidently before the throne, where we will find God's grace, his favor, as he extends that scepter to us. Why? Because we have come to his Son, and when he sees us, we are a reflection of his Son. Let's look back at Ephesians again. Ephesians, get there? Ephesians chapter 3 this time. And let's look at verse 12. "In union with him, with Messiah Yeshua, through his faithfulness," okay, "we have boldness and confidence when we approach God." Why can we have boldness and confidence when we approach God? Because we have faith in Yeshua, because of what Yeshua did, because of Yeshua's faithfulness. And we rest our trust on what he did in his faithfulness to the Father. In essence, it's almost as if Yeshua himself is that royal scepter that God extends to his people. And so we reach out and we touch the golden royal scepter of Yeshua HaMashiach, Jesus the Messiah. And so that is what is happening in the book of Esther. She has extended her hand to touch the golden scepter. She has won the king's favor. And let's keep going with what it says. Let's pick up in verse 3. "What is it you want, Queen Esther?" the king asked her. "Whatever your request, up to half the kingdom, it will be given to you." Now, is that just a euphemism for saying, okay, go ahead and ask what you want. I'm open to hearing what you have to say. I'm willing to grant it. Is that just a euphemism for that? Or is that something serious? He's saying, up to half my kingdom, I'm willing to grant you. Name your request. Well, I'm going to say something that we'll come back to later in our study of Esther. I'm going to say that this is not so much a euphemism as it is a limitation. A limitation. And that becomes very important in our study later on. And I'm not going to give it away as to why it's important, but it's important. Now, one thing we see in the book of Daniel, from the verses we read in Daniel, is that if you look at verse 14, that when Yeshua approaches the Ancient of Days, when he comes and is led into his Father's presence, what does verse 14 say? To him was given rulership, glory, and a kingdom. Yeshua gets the whole kingdom, not half the kingdom. His Father's not promising up to half of his kingdom. He's giving him rulership and the glory and the kingdom, so that all peoples nations, and languages should serve him. His rulership is an eternal rulership that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. Yeshua receives the entire kingdom, all the kingdoms, the entire kingdom of Israel, which during the millennial reign will spread his rulership. In essence, Israel will spread all over the planet because he will rule the whole earth. All the earth is his, right? All right. So we see that Esther has approached the king. He has said, what is your request? Up to half the kingdom. Remember I said that's a limitation. It will be given to you. And even that limitation is a huge thing. Verse 4. If it is all right with the king, answered Esther, let the king and Haman come today to the banquet I have prepared for him. If it is all right with the king. I'm not demanding your presence. You are my king. I am asking and requesting your presence to come to the banquet I have prepared for you. Interesting, because in chapter 1, was not King Xerxes at a banquet and requested the presence of Vashti at his banquet, and she refused him? And now we see the exact opposite. Esther, the queen, has prepared a banquet specifically for his king, or for her king, and he, as we know, is going to accept that invitation. But what I want to know, well, let's keep reading for just a minute. The king said, bring Haman quickly, so that what Esther has asked for can be done. So the king and Haman came to the banquet Esther prepared. Okay. Why did she request the presence of Haman? Esther is in a very difficult spot because there's a couple of things she's going to have to tell her husband, her king. Husband, I am a Jew, and you have just signed a decree for me and my people to die. She's going to have to reveal that information. But she doesn't want her finger pointing at her husband, going, how could you do that to me? How could you do that to my people? No. She's not going to point the finger to her husband. She's going to point the finger to Haman. That is why Haman is invited to the banquet. Because she knows that if her husband had known who she really was and what deception Haman was really placing before him, that he would have never agreed to what Haman had got him to agree to. She needs to reveal the information. She needs things to change, but she does not in any way want to point the finger to her husband, to her king. That is what Haman is there for. Okay? So she invites Haman as well. And they go to this banquet. In verse 6 or verse 7, if you're in a Christian Bible, a more traditional Christian Bible, sometimes the numbering in a Jewish version versus a Christian version, in some places, in some books, is a little different. But the verses and the words are the same, okay? So, but the numbering sometimes is a little different. So depending on what version you're in, it's either verse 6 or 7. At the banquet of wine, the king again said to Esther, whatever your request, you will be granted it. Whatever you want, up to half the kingdom, it will be done. So now they're at this banquet. It's just the three of them. Of course, there's servants around, I'm sure. But I want to back up for a minute. These things are going to be discussed at this banquet. But where did this request begin? Did it begin at the banquet? No. This request began in the courtroom of the king, before the king's throne. That is where this request began. And it was very important that it begin there, because it's going to come down to a royal courtroom decision. But in pulling them out of the courtroom and pulling them into, and not pulling them, but requesting them to come into this banquet for this discussion. This is kind of the equivalent of going into a courtroom and the judge and the lawyers going to the judge's chambers to discuss some things, and then they're going to come back out to the courtroom. Well, this banquet and the subsequent banquet that we'll talk about later are, in essence, taking place in the office of the judge. Okay, it's people coming before the judge privately, but it's going to come back out into the courtroom. Okay, there are some things that need to be said privately first, and then things will be dealt with back in the courtroom. That's the purpose of these banquets. Okay, so he gives this statement again about wanting to know her request. And Esther's answer is very interesting. Let's read it. Okay. Then Esther answered, my request, what I want is this. Notice how she is going to appeal to the pleasure and the favor and the grace of her husband, of her king. Okay. Verse 8. If I have won the king's favor, if I've really won your favor, if your grace is really upon me, if it pleases the king to grant my request and do what I want, let the king and Haman come to the banquet which I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king has said. I'm going to tell you what this is all about. Okay? But the first time we step away privately, I just need you to know that there is going to be an even more serious conversation than this one. In essence, she's saying, my king, my husband, if I have truly won your favor and your grace, if I truly please you as your wife, as your queen, remember she's in her royal robes. If I have obeyed my king, and if I am found pleasing in his sight, then I will tell you what it is I want, the banquet I will prepare for you tomorrow. She needs her husband to slow down, to not rush to judgment, to not rush to his decision. And she needs him, it's as if she is saying to him, my king, you really need to truly think about whether or not you really want to give me what I want, because what I'm going to ask is big. It is very big, and it is very important, and it even involves your queen. You need to be sure that you are willing to grant my request. If you are, my first request is that you return to a banquet I will prepare for you tomorrow. And again, all of this is taking place more than likely during the Feast of Unleavened Bread. We've at least gotten to the third day. More than likely, we are also within the counting of the Omer, right? Which is the counting up to the Feast of Shavuot or Pentecost. And for a Jew, that's an exciting count. It's not a countdown, it's a count up. It's an exciting count up, right? We're getting ready to get to that day 50, to that Jubilee day. So all of this is going on in that time period. And she needs her husband to truly mean what he says. When he says, I will grant it up to half my kingdom. Because, again, she's going to have to point the finger, and she needs to be able to point the finger to Haman. So Haman also needs to come with him. Well, Haman at this point, not knowing what the request is, of course, is he's just beside himself. He is so overjoyed, right? Let's see what the scriptures say about how Haman leaves this banquet, okay? Because when we come back in a couple of weeks, we'll talk about what happens to Xerxes that night. What happens to Xerxes as he awaits the second banquet, right? But here's what at least at first happens to Haman in awaiting that second banquet. So he leaves. That day, Haman went out happy and in good spirits. But when Haman saw Mordecai at the king's gate, so Mordecai is no longer in sackcloth and ashes. This is the day Esther was to go to the king and begin the request. So today he is back in his appropriate clothes, and he's back at the king's gate. Okay? That he neither rose nor moved for him, Haman was infuriated. So he starts out happy, and now he's infuriated. His emotions are like a roller coaster, depending on what he sees around him and how he perceives how others treat him. Okay? Don't want to be like that, do we? No. So Haman was infuriated with Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home, and where he summoned and brought his friends and Zeresh, his wife. Isn't it interesting we have his wife's name? Very, very interesting. I've heard some speculation through the years of people saying we have her name because it connects her to the two that actually tried to conspire against Xerxes earlier in the book of Esther and tried to assassinate him. Perhaps they were family. Why we're actually given her name, we don't really know. But we get her name, okay, which is interesting. Verse 11, Haman boasted to them about his vast wealth, his many sons, and remember within Zoroastrianism, that's a big deal, those many sons, and everything connected with how the king had promoted him and given him precedence over the other officials and servants of the king. Look at me, I'm the big deal. Right? That's what he was saying. Indeed, Haman added, Esther, the queen, let nobody into the banquet with the king that she had prepared except myself. The queen asked me to come to her banquet. Now, he has no idea that his queen is a Jew. No idea. Not to mention the daughter of the man he's infuriated with. And tomorrow, too, I am invited by her together with the king. Yet none of this does me any good at all as long as I keep seeing Mordecai the Jew remaining seated at the king's gate. Mordecai the Jew. He has no idea. It's Esther the Jewess. Okay? No idea. At this, Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends said to him, have a gallows 75 feet high constructed, and in the morning speak to the king about having Mordecai hanged on it. Then go in and enjoy yourself with the king at the banquet. Haman liked the idea, so he had the gallows made. This idea pleased him. Happy, infuriated, happy. All over the place are his emotions. These gallows are not what we would think of as hanging gallows. Okay? Not in terms of hanging one by the neck until they're dead. That's not these kind of gallows. These kind of gallows are what you hang and display a dead body on. Okay? So he wants Mordecai dead and displayed as a trophy. Dead and displayed as a trophy. That's what he wants to do to Mordecai. This, of course, is the end of chapter 5. Esther has come before her king in her royal best as his queen, as his wife. She has a huge request to ask of him. She has a huge piece of information to give him that he does not have. They have been married for 5 years. More than likely, they do have children. It would be unusual for a married couple, married 5 years, not to have children as of yet. So more than likely, they have children. And he still does not know who his wife truly is. Remember, her father had told her, now is the time to speak. Now is the time to reveal. Now is the time to stand. And so Esther is standing, and she has won the favor of her king. She has won his grace. He has put out that royal scepter. She has reached out and touched it and invited him to her banquet. Again, what a picture of what it is that we as the bride of Messiah, we have found the favor and grace of our King. And when our Father sees us, he sees his Son. We should be preparing ourselves for that day through obedience to our Father, obedience to our King, so that we may be in our royal bridal best. We can approach his throne with confidence because, yes, the King God Almighty, the Ancient of Days, puts out his royal scepter, who is his Son. And if we have reached out and we have taken and touched the Son, put our faith and our trust in him and what he did for us for our redemption, then we have won grace and favor before the throne. And we should have confidence in asking our requests. And our requests should always be in accordance with his word. If we are living according to his word, then our largest request should be that he continue through his Spirit to help us live according to his word and fulfill and do what it is he's asked us to do, to tell others about him, to brag about our King, not boast in ourselves, but boast in him, so that we may bring others to the throne. You see that in the writings of Paul, when he talks about wanting to present. It's in Corinthians, when he's talking about wanting to present the Corinthians before the throne, before their bridegroom, to their bridegroom, as a spotless bride. Right? He wants to be the one to present them. Why? Because he's the one who has ministered to them and told them about their King. And so he wants to be the one to present them to him. We should want to present others to our King. All right. That is our lesson for today. I hope you have enjoyed it. I hope it has been a blessing to you. Again, think about joining us for Passover. Just let us know you want to come, okay, and how many you want to bring. There is no cost, so you don't need to worry about that. We ask that if you do want to come, and you bring a side dish. That's the only cost we ask for, is just bring a side dish with you. And we would be glad to host you at Passover. We would be glad to host you and present you to the King at his banquet, because that's what Passover is. It is his banquet. It is a dress rehearsal for the banquet, the wedding banquet of the Lamb and his bride. The table of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So come join us for that if you can. If not, we pray that you have a good Passover, a blessed Passover. We'll talk about that more again next week, like I said. If you would please like and share the video. Let's get this out to as many people as we can so that others can be blessed going into the presence of their King. I hope you have had a blessed day. I know I have enjoyed being with you. I look forward to seeing you next week. And again, we are here for such a time as this. Shalom.